Greetings and salutations. This is Abdelhadi with The Bitter Truth, where we may not have all the answers, but we're going to ask an awful lot of questions. Today, live from the Longhorn Saloon in Austin, Texas, from the basement, is the newly declared President of the United States, hiding in Texas until we can get his inaugural done with a real priest and everything after the chicken shit bingo game. None other than activist, boots on the ground, perennial motherfucker who knows everything about everything, which is why he's a friend of the show. Adrian Boutureira, are you there?
I'm here. Thank you, Abe. Yes, that's President of the Republic of Texas.
That's
by
right.
The way.
That's right.
Yes.
I'm from California. We smoke pot. Yeah.
I told Abbott, that the declaration is official, and since we're living in this age where all you have to do is self-declare yourself, man. I mean, that's just the new rule of government. Just self-declare yourself, and the United States and the European Union and the self-declared leader of the Organization of States, who himself is taking huge liberties to say pretty much anything that he wants without a vote or anything, and even calling for the armed overthrow of a member state. This guy just go ahead and took that liberty. So at this point in time, I encourage all of our listeners to just go out there and start taking the liberty.
That's right. We do by doing. That's
yeah. HEB is looking for a new president. I heard. You can lower the price of Lone Star beer, which has went up by 75 cents last week, and we can have that.
That's right. Well, and in all seriousness, you sent me a link a couple of days ago with an interview. And one of the points that the interviewee that was being interviewed, this Irish guy that he made, was like Clinton, who actually did run in an election and did win the popular vote, but lost the Electoral College. I mean, what would happen if she, and to catch our listeners up, we are going to talk about Venezuela for a little bit today, but what if she walked into Congress and declared herself president by decree because she got the popular vote? What would happen?
Yeah, no, I mean, it is truly absurd, Abe, and I think we should go to the point of what is actually happening here. I mean, I am truly concerned. Mm-hmm. Last time we spoke, the noises and the rumblings were there. But I am kind of seeing the playbook kind of getting activated. And whenever that happens, I brace myself for the worst. In this case, as of this morning, the European Union gave Maduro, the Maduro government, a duly elected democratic government, whether they like it or not, 8 days.
Yeah, I saw that.
To call for new elections, or they will recognize, this sort of proclaimed interim president, a guy by the name of Juan Guaido, in Venezuela as the new interim president of Venezuela. I have not been able to find any precedent in international law by which foreign countries or a union of foreign countries of any sort can demand that a nation, internationally recognized nation, forces premature elections. So I don't, I am concerned that the noises that are being made precede, more direct and dangerous actions by the same players of always.
Right.
Now, how that is going to manifest itself in Latin America with the history and the sensitivities that, Latin Americans and Latin American governments have, towards foreign intervention remains to be seen. Yet, I'm not putting anything past them at this point.
No, because, I mean, not to interrupt you, but that's the other challenge, too, is that it's not, what you the point you made a second ago, you haven't seen anything like this, is because the corporatocracy never had this much of a foothold into the psyche of most of the industrialized world. They keep saying state-run media when they talk about Russia or whatever. We have a state-run media. It's Comcast-run media. It's Time Warner, AT&T run media. If the Koch brothers had to pay for a fucking war, it would be over tomorrow, and they would not be talking about intervention of any kind in any country. But this is unprecedented, and we got a little bit of a lead up, in my opinion, when Trump declared Jerusalem, which was not a declared capital of Israel, not even by the UN. Now there's 20 countries on board, 20 of our toady countries that do what we tell them to do under duress. So, but one thing I wanted to ask you really quick was, because I want to hit a couple of fallacies that I've been seeing in the mainstream press. I mean, fucking NPR became CBS. I cannot. I listen to it for homework now. I can't stand them. So the other day they had a couple of people on who were pro Guaido people, and they were talking about the streets and everything. But the first fallacy I want to handle is the mainstream press is now overdrive, full throttle that Maduro was not democratically elected. They're comparing his elections to the old Saddam Hussein elections, who would, Allah would let him win by 99%, right? So I want to tackle that first fallacy because I've read too many things where, yes, he was democratically elected. There was an entire party who chose not to even participate in the elections. Let's jump into that because I wanted to ask about some of the other things too. But let's kind of handle that first. What are your thoughts on that? What have you found?
Okay, so I mean, in 2015, the Venezuelan oppositions, won legislative elections, right? Which basically gave them a majority in the National Assembly. That was the first time, that they had that since the Chavez, sort of Bolivarian revolution process came to power. And that opened up, a whole window into, a stalemate of conflict and institutional blocking, amongst the state powers, right? Mm-hmm. Now, the Maduro has called for a process of negotiation, of mediation, but let us not forget that the folks who are sitting in the National Assembly of Venezuela and the leadership is actually the same leadership that was behind and that actually openly advocated for the illegal coup in 2002. I mean, folks need to remember that in 2002 there was an actual coup attempt against Hugo Chavez in Venezuela. With who were the protagonists? Enrique Capriles, Leopoldo López, Maria Corina Machado, Henry Ramos Alup, Julio Borges, amongst others. Now, these folks who were all openly in support of the coup, and you talk about errors, and you talk about, okay, so if you take those folks and you throw them in jail for treason, right? Because basically, you as a politician, are not supposed to be in the business of, as a democratic politician, supposedly, you're not supposed to be in the business of overthrows and coup d'etats. You're supposed to be in the business of getting yourself elected.
Right.
So these folks, and in my view, the error, because when you're a leftist government in Latin America or the world, anywhere in the third world, constantly, you are supposed to tolerate this. In other words, in my opinion, these folks should have been put in jail for treason, and not let out. But of course, had Chavez done that, what would have been the charge? Dictatorship, tyrant, anti-democratic, right?
Right.
So here we have, a governing body that now, having gained, the majority in that context, has now moved to, destabilize the country, destabilize the executive, destabilize the judiciary, and not responding to calls for, a proper, reconciliation process and how to move the country forward. On top of that, on top of that, they are additionally calling for violence mobilizations, in turn, provoking confrontations, provoking violence in the streets, and then, of course, using that for additional leverage as to why, making their case towards another, coup d'etat, another overthrow, regime change. The Constituent Assembly that was called, and that's what they're saying that Maduro is using, bypassing the power of the National Assembly, but by convoking the Constitutional Assembly, he has a precedent, and there is constitutionally the articles are there for him to have been able to do that. The article, I think it's 489. I can allows for the president to call for a Constituent Assembly in order to address constitutional changes that need to happen, and the idea is that the changes needed to happen in the Constitution in order to provide greater power to the newly formed root-based power structures, the communal power structures that were a big part of the original, constitutional changes in 1999.
Right.
As the National Assembly aimed and worked to weaken the power of those emerging, mostly grounded in the working class and indigenous communities. This was the vision of Hugo Chavez for transforming the structures of power. Is there a vision for transforming the structure of power? Yes, there is. And so the struggle lies therein. You have the entrenched oligarchy with their entrenched base, maintaining power through that entrenched base, working systemically to weaken and discredit the state. The state, in some ways, not necessarily innocent, because let's be honest, by Maduro's own recognition, his government has been struggling, with issues of corruption internally.
Well, and real quick though, I mean, to kind of piggyback on a conversation you and I had, I think one of the first conversations we had, wasn't that sort of the challenge with the Chavez government? Was he did not root out the old school guys who got rich from the previous administrations, plural? I mean, wasn't that part of Chavez's failure? Because they're also not a socialist. They're not a true socialist government. Everyone keeps saying socialist. That's why we have to invade them, which I think is the stupidest shit I've ever heard. But isn't that the case though with Maduro now? Is that he's still dealing not only with sanctions and everything else? Everyone keeps saying that the system failed. I mean, first of all, they're not a socialist government. Second of all, the system. What part of the 105 sanctions we have against that country? I mean, what failures are we going to talk about? But just this point here, though, isn't this the National Assembly that Guaido is part of? Isn't that sort of the deal that, or the same sort of the same parties that Chavez was dealing with himself, and now Maduro's kind of still dealing with that entrenched base? Is that inaccurate?
Right. No. I mean, it's accurate, and furthermore, I mean, it is sort of like a coalition of opposition, forces from within the oligarchy, and in all honesty, there is also, folks within the left, and even within the radical left that have had problems, with the Chavez process, which is now the Maduro process, because of that. Because there are plenty of historical precedents that point to what are the challenges faced, in any transformation towards a more socialistic society. Now, clearly, the idea is that under this concept of democratic process, which remains to be seen how democratic it is. I mean, who can buy it?
Mm-hmm.
Who controls it?
Mm-hmm.
What is actually, it's how democratic was the process of getting Clinton elected, as the Democratic nominee? How democratic was the process of even Trump being elected without? There is a wide array of ideas that one can understand as such. Now, for some of the old school folks, believing that, look, it's been proven to be practically impossible.
Right.
To have a transformative process when you have, let's say, an executive and even a parliamentary, or congressional, majority that is socialistic, or at least leaning towards socialistic reforms.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Because Lagos in Paraguay was not necessarily a socialist. A social democrat or a democratic socialist at best, if we want to define that a little bit further, and what does that mean? That means that you are attempting to make, fundamental reforms to correct inequities, to correct historical inequities, many inherited from colonialism and that are still latent, inequalities that are often informed by race. The barbarity, the brutality of racism in Brazil, the brutality of racism in Venezuela.
Sure.
It's very much aligned with class.
Oh, listen.
And now,
racism in Brazil is worse than America. People don't. My mother's Brazilian, and she's half Swiss, and she looks like a white chick. Now her hair is gray, but back in the day it was black. But she looked like your garden variety white chick. And I've been to Brazil, and I'll tell you right now, looking like me and my mom, you get an easier time of it than if you look like some of my cousins.
The opportunities are
media,
you
everything.
name it.
Yeah, you name it.
I have family in Brazil too. I have family in Venezuela, and the oligarchy is 90% white, and they live in entrenched, walled-in communities and walled-in resorts.
Right.
And like I told, a friend of mine, who basically sort of pushed back a little bit. I said, okay, well, you're Guatemalan, you're white. You tell me the last time you saw an indigenous woman playing golf in the Guatemala City Country Club. And then you tell me, that, no, it doesn't happen. Now, let me get back to what I was going to summarize, real quick here. The issue of this transformation, Abe, which basically it's long overdue all across the global South. Inequalities, inequities, injustices, brutal injustices that are legacies of the colonial era have been attempted within the context of what liberal capitalism teaches us democracy needs to look like. Now, without failure, in Latin America, at least, starting with Pinochet, when these transformations have not been allowed to be carried out. We have, without going much further, like I said, we have Honduras, the involvement of the United States in the Honduran military coup that got rid of Zelaya, and having, attempted to pass reforms that would benefit the working class, that would force the international fruit companies to provide a living wage. Zelaya was overthrown. He was democratically elected for real, and he got pulled out in the middle of the night in his pajamas, and Obama was like hemming and hawing. Well, I don't know if we should. And Hillary talked him into it. Yes, the conspiracy to get Dilma Rousseff in Brazil out of power. There's still like a huge question as to where is the evidence for the charges that basically led to her impeachment. Mm-hmm. No, then we have President Lagos in Paraguay. Now, this is the question that, I am, even if folks who are listening have doubts, Adrian sounds like, typical leftist, rhetoric in a way, just sort of, not wanting to accept that this regimes inherently shut themselves in the foot. No, okay, they can think that, but think about how can you achieve a socialist transformation when the means of production and the means of distribution are left in the hands of the people who basically have nothing in common with what you are trying to promote. And then you can start to understand how the undermining, the disinvestment, one of the first things that the Venezuelan oligarchy did, as an attempt of destabilizing the regime, was to disinvest. Okay, right. Millions and millions and millions and millions of dollars were taken out of Venezuela and put in foreign banks to try to weaken the economy. And that's just not the industrial sabotage at the level of management in the oil refineries, in the national oil company, Citgo. The scarcity that has been fabricated of medicine and food with the complicity of the Colombian government. Now, of course, if you appropriate these industries, if you nationalize these industries, what is going to be the immediate response of the West? Dictatorship, tyrant. So you land between a rock and a hard place. Mm-hmm. Now, have there been mistakes made? And I believe this is the funny thing is the mistakes that I think were made in the Bolivian revolutionary process may not be the same of what maybe a liberal Democrat or even a progressive liberal may think. Mm-hmm. The mistakes that I feel were made were to not go for the jugular immediately, okay? Because like you were saying, these people are not just the oligarchy that was in power before, keeping in place, institutionalized systems of inequality, but these were also people who were directly involved and can be directly identified as having supported illegal attempts at the overthrow of the democratic elected government, and they were still allowed to walk around. And now so the chickens have come home to roost, right? Because there was no real process for saying, because if you show your hard hand and you have been classified as a socialist, you would immediately, that's what they need. That's the excuse that they're looking for. So in some ways also Chavez did not necessarily come from a Marxist academic background. No. If anything, he was a military man, right? And he was indeed a strong believer in the original principles of Simón Bolívar's kind of intercontinental liberation, justice and equality process. But he kind of learned to become a more and more educated Marxist, as things went on. But a lot of mistakes were made. A lot of mistakes were made. Sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead. Finish your thought. I'm sorry.
No, that's it.
So here's the thing. So I want to hit 3 points that to kind of crystallize this for folks that are now just suddenly understanding what South America is. I mean, I'm seeing all kinds of ersatz experts all of a sudden on South America. So, I mean, I thought it was interesting that, the Democrats, only 3 Democrats, by the way, decried this entire coup. Nancy Pelosi's like, we support the new. I'm sorry, weren't you guys crying about an election fraud and now you're going to overturn a guy who was democratically elected? The first question I wanted to hit on was he democratically elected or was it a Saddam Hussein type of an election? Because I know he was not. He did not strong arm his way into that reelection. I mean, so who did he run against?
Well, I mean, he ran against the opposition, and the opposition, basically, some decided to boycott it, some did not. The opposition itself was not united in
by choice. Process. Correct? Though they decided.
Yes, by choice. Right. Yeah. Okay. There was no, yes, there was no, rounding up of the opposition, and no. In other words, that was part of the process to try to delegitimize the regime, to try, to basically, and it failed, right?
Right.
We have to understand that the disenfranchised people of Venezuela, even under the hardships that they're experiencing because of the acts of industrial sabotage and the forced lack of essential medicines that are due to the sanctions. I mean, you name it. The people remain rather aware that there is a sort of deep-rooted historical conflict being fought here that they are not willing to walk away from, because for a lot of folks, which is constitutes the majority of Venezuelan people, the Chavez regime has provided them with their first glimpse of a hopeful future for their children, breaking away from sort of like that pattern of exploitation and historical patterns of exploitation and systems of oppression that began to get dismantled through Chavismo, through Chavez. They are aware of that. They are aware of the power that when Chavez was able to establish the communal power structures that began to bypass the corrupt established political power, and he was able to send money directly to this new emerging community leadership structures for projects, for community-based economic development, for to actually like build schools, to actually build their own health community centers. People felt invigorated and recognized, and for the first time, as I was told by many people, we are Venezuela. One of the tales that I can tell you from my own family experience comes from the fact that my folks in Venezuela come from the white elite. And I was having a candid conversation. I went to visit them when I went to Venezuela for like a couple of days. And basically it's like, our maid comes in the other day and basically tell us it's like, the country's ours now. You know what I mean? It's like, how dare they?
Yeah.
Now, that sort of deep-rooted, kind of sense of empowerment is the thing that put the biggest fear into the oligarchy, right? In other words, because when you understand how feudal the human relationships have been in Latin America, when you understand that even today, you sometimes go to Guatemala and as a white person, when an indigenous person approaches you, they almost, they look down because they were, because of the legacy of brutality, the legacy of racist, brutality that has been imposed, right? So we're like, an indigenous person is not supposed to look a white person in the eye.
Right.
So when these people finally see, when the opportunity presents itself, it comes with a lot of force and it comes with a lot of power. Right. And it comes, and so this becomes manifested on the streets. And so I believe that the bulk of the nature of illegality, okay, the claim of illegality comes over the calling for the National Constituent Assembly, for the formation of the National Constituent Assembly, and I recall there are the article in the Constitution. There is Article 348 of the Constitution, establishes the mechanism and the powers by which this can be, convened, right? Who can convene, and the president has the power to convene the National Assembly according to Article 348.
Right.
Now, the article that precedes Article 348 is Article 347. The Article 347 states that as of the Constitution of 1999, the people of Venezuela have the inherent power of something to that effect. I'm sort of to actually call the Constituent Assembly. So they're citing Article 347 and forgetting to say that the following article gives the power to the president. And it also gives the power, by the way, to the National Assembly. So they are using that kind of, they're saying that Article 347, and they're not ever mentioning Article 348. Article 347 obviously precedes Article 348. Article, says that the people of Venezuela have the right at any time to call for the formation of a constituent assembly to address, major constitutional issues that need to be created, through the existence of the Constitutional Assembly. And then Article 348, recognizes which are those mechanisms of the people. And the mechanisms of the people are the National Assembly and the presidency. Either or can call for the formation of. So the president was within his legal rights. Now, because everywhere you look, you will see the legality of that being challenged. That is what's being used. They are claiming that by having called for the formation of the Constituent Assembly, he violated the Constitution, which is not true, and in order to bypass the power of the National Assembly, right? And that by trying to bypass the National Assembly, they're calling it an auto coup, a self coup. Right. In other words,
which is why you're calling us right now from the Longhorn Saloon in Austin, Texas, in the basement, because you did the same thing.
I did the same thing, but a little bit more daring, perhaps, than Maduro's, because he was within the letter of the law as far as a lot of so now. But once you open, in other words, there is no one, and you were talking about NPR, at least in the United States, there is very little that people are hearing about the details that I just described.
Right.
And, and the bottom line is, I probably lost some of the folks in the process as I was speaking about those details.
Oh, listen, that's irrelevant. I give a shit who we lose. If we lost them, they're stupid. But really quick, this is a question that I want to really get into, and you've been around this question, but you mentioned NPR and the U.S. media because they keep talking it. They keep treating this like he's goddamn Saddam Hussein. So. Who did Maduro jail? Why? And did that have any impact on his being reelected?
I don't know who got jailed by Maduro. I mean, there was, one of the guys who was involved in the coup, and who basically was calling for the direct overthrow of the government. Ended up, doing time on house arrest for insurrection.
Right.
But ultimately, the leadership of the opposition has pretty much remained intact. And so I basically, regardless, this is an issue. How is it that the United States and Europe are in the business of interfering into the, affairs of an independent nation? In some ways, I thought that this is why the United Nations was created. If indeed this is some sort of international crisis, then, why is the Security Council not getting involved, but instead, we're dealing with this, through the U.S. and its allies, right? In other words, we can go. The problem is one has to not lose track of the big picture. Okay, because I mean, an argument can be, this is what Gaddafi was a tyrant. Gaddafi was oppressing its people. Gaddafi, but I mean, by what authority did the French and the Americans, decide that it was time to have Gaddafi murdered and to basically send Libya back to the Dark Ages, right? Because no one has assumed responsibility for the disaster that has ensued. No one has assumed responsibility for the disaster that ensued. At what point have we accepted that the West or the United States or the First World has the arbitrary decision-making authority to decide what regime is legitimate, what regime is not illegitimate, outside of any context of international law, right? Because I am challenging anybody to tell me by what authority has the European Union decided, to give the Maduro government a mandate, a deadline, to declare new elections in Venezuela
in 8 days. Yeah.
Or they will recognize the leadership of a man who has not been elected by anybody to be interim president. But he said it in he said it in passing at one point, and that was enough for them to say, oh well, since this guy has self-declared himself to be, prepared to be the interim president. I mean, I don't believe that even the National Assembly, itself has had that process to declare this guy, because I know that they would be in violation of the Constitution to be declaring a new president, while there is a standing precedent.
Well, you touched on. I'm sorry to interrupt you, but you touched on this a few minutes back. It's not a big mystery. The EU would never do this to a white country. I mean, one of the few white countries that we fucked with openly was the Ukraine. Everywhere else, it's like they have their elections, dictatorship or not. When Ceausescu got taken, tried and shot, that wasn't necessarily our doing. We helped them a little bit, but those people rallied and did it themselves. We didn't declare the new guy. None of that. This with Venezuela right now, with the EU and the United States and Canada, that is genuinely Anglo-Saxon, colonial, imperialist, white hegemony. No questions asked. We're going to sit there and give you, by the way, you were elected last year, but we're going to give you 8 days to have a new election. Fuck you. Who the fuck are you? And by the way, if he was such a goddamn dictator, he would have taken Guaido and shot him. Okay? If he was such a dictator, he would. I heard Guaido is hiding in the Colombian embassy, which is interesting. They just became a NATO member. But
right.
But if he was such a dictator, he would invade the embassy, kind of like Iran invaded the U.S. embassy in '79. He would have invaded the embassy, taken Guaido out, and fucking shot him if he was such a dictator. And I'm not saying Maduro is perfect. I'm not saying he's this, Shangri-La guy. I mean, to be honest, they've got their challenges. Are they socialist? Not by my estimation, kind of like we talked about. But to sit there and say that goddamn, who the fuck are we? And by the way, we have been creating Vietnam for the last 70 years. Every goddamn war we've been in, since Korea, through Vietnam, through both Iraqs, through Afghanistan, Libya, we have created nothing but destruction, death, false narratives. We lost Vietnam. Not because we were weak or had no resolve. We didn't fucking belong there. And ever since World War II, we have been fighting these wars alone. We don't have a coalition of countries. The Brits throw in a few people, the Canadians throw in a few people, but we are there by ourselves. The United States is there by themselves. That's why they keep losing these fucking wars, and we've lost every war since Korea. Korea was a draw because Eisenhower had the temerity to say, you know what, fuck it, we'll split it at the 38th parallel. There's a north, there's a south. We just lost 60,000 guys. I'm not doing this again. And he pulled out of Truman's war, and nobody missed a beat.
Yeah, I mean, you can look back into the Gulf of Tonkin or even from the Mexican-American War, and
Yes.
and you will find repeats of. But this is perhaps this could very well be one of the most brazen
Yeah, it's more egregious. It's more egregious
of gangsterism, because
Absolutely.
I mean in reality, like I was reading an article by George Galloway. Remember him,
Yes.
the member of the British Parliament?
Yes.
And, he basically said that, in his opinion, not since Hitler justified blitzing Poland by claiming that he had encroached on the frontier into Nazi Germany, has there been a more blatant set of lies and deceptions, adduced, as a pretext for conflict, right? I mean, in other words,
That's right.
the amount of money. This is not about Maduro. This is not even about Chavez. Who was basically, recognized even by Jimmy Carter. As having been elected in one of the most democratic processes that he had ever witnessed, and he did a lot of those.
Let me stop you.
Election monitoring things.
Let me stop you right there. Let me stop right there for a second. You mentioned the attempted coup in 2002 under George W. Bush, when they tried to literally kidnap Chavez like we did with Noriega in Panama. And if it wasn't for his military standing up for him and keeping his side and keeping the government as a priority, then he would have been chopped up and fed to the poor. Right.
And a lot of the folks who are in power in the opposition now allowed, to basically go about their business by Chavez. And for the life of me, I do not understand that. Or Maduro for that matter, who could have very well, prosecuted these folks for their participation in subversion, sabotage, these folks are now, in the opposition, and they are basically leading a lot of these processes. They are the ones who are basically continuing to. So the process it's just been going on since 2002, like nonstop.
Right.
Now, Colombia's case as an associate member of NATO. It's.
I'm sorry. That's just funny. That's like Mars. Let's make Mars a part of NATO. But continue. I'm sorry.
No, but basically it is now. Colombia becomes the beachhead in Latin America for Western imperialism to offset. Now, because it introduces an alliance with nuclear capability,
right,
into the continent. That alone is in violation of several different international agreements that Colombia has made. Right, that alone is in violation. But we have to ask ourselves, what is in it for the United States, right? And now Colombia is the country in Latin America that has the most violations of human rights against journalists, against labor leaders, against indigenous leaders, closely followed by, Brazil now coming, very close recently, right?
On a side question, do you think Brazil will become a NATO nation?
Brazil has applied.
Okay.
Brazil is in the. It's now one of the. It's to strengthen the capacity of the Colombian armed forces is one of the objectives of this sort of new membership that has been granted to Colombia. One has to ask why. Right? Why was Colombia made a member of NATO last year, while the campaign against Venezuela continues to increase? And of course, folks have to remember that Venezuela is one of the richest oil producing, one of the biggest oil producing countries in the world, and remains, a major strategic asset. Right, to the United States. And so we have to ask ourselves, at what point does the introduction of Colombia as an affiliate, NATO member state, come into this picture? And what is the timing of that? Now we have to wait and see. I am doing a little bit of research to find out if this, membership entails, the same guarantees that other members are granted, which is like, if they get attacked, in NATO, every state has the responsibility to come to the defense of any other state, member state.
Mauritania is now going to come to the defense of Colombia, then, is what we're saying.
Well, yeah, what we're talking about here is that if usually conflicts are created, like a border region conflict. There's been a lot of provocation by the Colombian armed forces on the Venezuelan border now for like the last 3 or 4 years. Now, if Colombia, as a member of NATO, happens to engage in a direct military conflict with the Venezuelan government over a border issue that we will never find out, of course, we will be told that, the Venezuelans are to blame, right? And then, we will find out the truth 10 years from now when it's too late and nothing will be done about it.
Right.
I'm not saying that that's going to happen because I hate to speculate. I'm just worrying about the timing of the acceptance of Colombia into the NATO alliance, and what could be the consequences if a border conflict were to ensue. And those are the NATO states obligated to come to Colombia's defense as a member state under this, this membership.
But you made the point earlier, though. It's not even about member states. I mean, I don't think England's going to come to the aid, quote unquote, of Colombia. You made the point a second ago that it's a beachhead. We can legally now do what Russia tried to do in Cuba in the 60s. We can legally now put American nuclear warheads in Colombia as a defense strategy because they are now a NATO member.
Right.
And aim them anywhere in South America we want. Central America, we can aim them anywhere we want. Central America, South America, we can aim them anywhere we want. Colombia is...
No, the problem is that, Colombia is a signatory to the treaty, for the prohibition of nuclear weapons in Latin America. And that was the Havana Declaration.
Okay.
Okay. Oh my God. I'm not as old as I thought. This is all. When I remember things like this, I get so happy. I mean, so
I get it. Trust me,
the Havana, the Havana Declaration proclaims Latin America and the Caribbean a zone of peace. And it is the treaty for the prohibition of nuclear weapons in Latin America.
Right.
It also contravenes, the security agreements made by the Defense Council of the Union of South American Nations. And Colombia remains, massive inequalities. It is insane that they would, NATO. Okay, so NATO and the EU, to me, in my mind, are very much interconnected. Even though, of course, NATO is something else and has been created for something else. But it ultimately remains almost like the armed wing of the European Union alliance,
absolutely,
right?
Absolutely.
Now with Britain thrown into it. Now, here we have a situation. I mean, and let me just say something about Spain and the hypocrisy of Spain in particular. The opposition inside Spain is accusing, the government of Pedro Sanchez, a so-called socialist, of himself having come to power illegally or not illegally, but at least through the fabrication of an alliance which is ultimately potentially serving to undermine the Spanish state. What do they mean by that? That in order for him to be able to sort of successfully depose the last government on what was ultimately a parliamentary process that declared, that it was a vote of no confidence, right? That he was able to actually succeed upon by coming into an alliance with, the so-called nationalist forces within Spain, particularly the Basques and the Catalonians, right?
Right.
Now, what the right wing is saying is like, you forge an alliance with the enemies of the nation, as we understand them, the anti-constitutional forces of the nation, in order for you to come to power. So now that you're in power, we are demanding that you legitimize your rule by calling early elections. he says, you know what he said? He says they can sit and wait. I am not calling for early elections.
Good.
Now he's doing in his own country, right? Supposedly what he's accusing, manipulating the sort of, parliamentary process, to deny what basically the right wing claims to be a necessary step, which would be early elections that would legitimize his government if indeed he has the support of the people. And he says no. He says, I'm not calling for early elections. I don't recognize that my alliances with the nationalists is counter to my commitment to the Spanish nation. Mm-hmm. Well, they beg to disagree, but that's the end of that, right? I don't see Germany. I don't see Britain. I don't see France, basically calling for him to declare elections in 8 days, or basically they're going to support, let's say the self-proclaimed new president of Spain,
right.
New prime minister of Spain of the opposition party. So it is, regardless of what your listeners think about this, the one thing that I always encourage people is to challenge the hypocrisy, to challenge how in the world can we be sending millions of dollars to Egypt? At what point because the playbook is not that different, right, Abe? I mean, the playbook that was applied because in Egypt to bring to power, to allow for the military coup that ensued, right?
Right.
And for the following, transformation of the general that led the coup into a civilian elected president in an election that he controlled.
Yeah, but
right?
but we didn't like his party, so we had him put in jail.
No, I'm not talking about Mubarak. I'm talking about the guy who's in power right now.
Oh, no, I'm talking about Mohamed Morsi getting arrested, and we put the guy who's in power right now into power.
Yes, of course. And this after basically making sure that for whatever reason, we justified the overthrow of the Islamic Brotherhood that was democratically elected, but
right.
We just didn't like it doesn't matter. Democracy doesn't matter. Okay, Hamas was democratically elected to run Palestine, but we decided that Hamas is a terrorist organization, so we denied the Palestinians their democratic voice.
Right.
So we decided that the Palestinian Authority is the legitimate representative of the Palestinian people.
What the
Palestinian people decided.
The bought and paid for Palestinian Authority.
Yes, yeah, of course, but Abe, even if what I'm trying to say is that, beyond the nuances, beyond the fine print, beyond the details, beyond what you and I may know or think is it's behind each of these regimes. Okay, what people need to realize is that this is not about the good guys versus the bad guys. This is about, how to advance, political forces represent economic powers. Economic powers are represented, through states that have the capacity to basically mobilize massive amounts of resources to negate at any time, what they deem to be, the potential threat, because it was Obama who basically declared Venezuela as a fundamental threat to the strategic interest of the United States, right? He made that declaration. I mean, That is in the books.
Right.
All right. So ever since then, for whatever reason, because at that point, Venezuela, no one could have denied that Chavez, like Jimmy Carter said, that this was a legitimately elected government, right? I mean, to the point where he was massively supported in an incredibly clean democratic process that no one could even find. The ones who wanted to find flaw couldn't find flaw in it.
Right.
So now Obama then, so you lay the groundwork. You support. You instigate. Now the United States. How in the world was it that Yugoslavia under Tito and following, even as the Soviet Union was collapsing, remained a functional and succeeding state, And then how is it that Yugoslavia broke into 25 little, insignificant republics that have absolutely no leverage or power now? And this was happening systematically as Germany was unifying. Okay, the Eastern countries, especially the countries that had the strongest and most solvent and most successful economies, were being broken down. What was the role of Free Radio Europe? What was the role of the National Endowment for Democracy when they were sending millions and millions of dollars to foment any right-wing nationalist movement that would commit to fighting and to destabilizing the state? They would pay for.
Right.
And they do it. And so now we have Yugoslavia, we have Serbia, Montenegro, Slovenia, Bosnia-Herzegovina. Then, as if it wasn't enough, let's go ahead and punish the Serbs even more after we bomb them and destroy their infrastructure. Let's go ahead and give Kosovo to the Albanians while we're at it, right? And that's completely really left without analysis, right? Because Yugoslavia was successful. Yugoslavia was, and now everybody that you talk to, this is like, oh my God, life was so much better then. Yes, okay, well, how is it? What role did the National Endowment for Democracy, which is a front organization for promoting,
but they're all front organizations. All of this is a front. If the American media would honestly portray the Koch brothers, Exxon, etc., as the main benefactors of a democratized, quote unquote, Venezuela, people would wake up and go, well, fuck that. But we're not. That's not the information they're getting.
No, they're not. And of course, they're also forgetting to say what have been, what are some of the things. Okay, so the Maduro regime may be dealing with an incredible internal problem of corruption in its ranks. Okay, but what have been some of the objectives? What are the objectives of the Bolivarian Revolution? I mean, you will never hear that on NPR. What has been achieved? The land reform that gave indigenous people back their land. Right? The actual decrees that were passed that guarantee, housing and healthcare to the poor, something that Venezuela had never achieved, had never done. That's why people are still coming out on the street, right? Hundreds of thousands of people came out in support of the process and of Maduro 2 days ago, right?
Mm-hmm. That's right.
And we will continue to see that. Now, because behind it all, we have to try to understand, like, what forces, and I've had this discussion, because I have some of my own friends, many of whom are leftist, self-confessed leftist, basically saying, like, Maduro has betrayed the revolution, and Maduro needs to go, and I'm willing to have that conversation with them on the side. Because we need to basically never lose track of what could be, negative processes, good processes gone bad, right? Or good, processes of socialist transformation that begin to fall so short of its objective that we actually need to, revamp it somehow with some radical changes.
Okay.
Perhaps. But having said that, that does not mean that, this conversation needs to be had now, and which begins to basically, provide support for the running narrative that Maduro needs to go, when the people who are trying to have Maduro go right now are not the organized revolutionary leftist of Venezuela. They will not be the people who are going to come into power if this coup process goes through, right? We are going to regress to the same oligarchical, racist, colonialist regime that the Venezuelans had known for the bulk of their history until Chavez came to power. So that's what I need to remind people. Like, don't lose track of making sure that we oppose this sort of, like, winds of overthrow, right? We oppose this attempted coup. And then, the Venezuelan people have to be trusted to carry out the necessary internal work that needs to be done, to remedy what the Maduro regime or the Maduro government needs fixing.
Okay, let me ask you a question really quick in the last few minutes we've got, and obviously we could probably take this up in the next time we talk, but how does this not play into? I think it's very convenient that this is not completely overshadowing, but it is running neck and neck to the government shutdown and the near end of the government shutdown. So, like, what are your thoughts on that? Like, was this like a wag the dog kind of a thing? Let's pay attention to Venezuela now because the media is all over this shit now, and they're not really paying attention to the government shutdown.
Well, the government was shut down, as far as like paying its workers was concerned, but it was obviously not shut down when it came to, fomenting and fueling an illegal coup in a sovereign country.
There you go.
So, I mean, the government, the wolves never sleep, man. And so basically, I think what ultimately, I believe that, the air traffic controllers basically, have had a thorn on their side ever since, Reagan destroyed their union and reduced them to basically, a complete subservient, service of the United States government without any labor rights, right? Mm-hmm. Well, they've had, I think that what happened in LaGuardia Airport, which basically shut down air traffic. I mean, I think that Trump realized that, he may just have bitten more than he could chew, and ultimately realizes that, this whole argument about the wall, while, may earn them brownie points towards the next election because he's going to be able to blame the Democrats for not having funded it, right? And he won. He had what he wanted. He doesn't give a shit about the wall. You know what I mean? Him and his friends, they need as much immigrant labor as they can get their hands on so they can exploit the shit out of them and fucking pay them $5 an hour to work like 10 hours a day. Or not pay them at all like the contractors do here in Austin, Texas, where they go to the Home Depot, pick them up, make them work all week, tell them we're going to pay you at the end of the week, then dump them off and never pay them again. And now, because of the new draconian laws that we have, these poor guys don't even have any recourse to have, that legally addressed by anybody.
Wow.
So, that is the hypocrisy of these folks, man. Their fortunes have been made, on the backs of the exploited, on the back of the disenfranchised. But, it plays well to foment hatred. It plays well to foment ignorance, right? Because that's the age in which we live. And that's why it's important that we have you, and we have folks that are daring to be able to, at least to the best of our ability, because we make mistakes, man. I make mistakes, right?
Sure, absolutely.
I mean, it would be absurd to think that, like, what I'm saying is always going to be right on target. But at least we're attempting to think for ourselves and encouraging other folks to think as well. And do your research, find out, you know what I mean? Do not succumb to, like, bullshit conspiracy theories. The reality is horrid enough, Abe. The facts, the actual facts, without having to dig beyond, cloak and dagger bullshit.
Right.
All we need to do is just analyze the facts, right? What is our relationship to these dictators? And what is our relationship to these other dictators? And how are we deciding that these guys deserve, $90 billion a year worth of aid, and these guys need to be overthrown? And so basically, then we start to identify. Then we as individuals can start to identify, not with this bullshit concept of what constitutes, a liberal democracy, but we need to identify with who is struggling for what.
Right.
Who are my people? Who are my people in Venezuela? The fucking oligarchs or the indigenous people whose land is going to be returned to the fucking landowners the moment that this oligarch come to power? I don't give a shit how these oligarchs are kept out of power. I know who my people are, and right. I know whose interest I stand behind.
Well, see,
whatever means necessary, man. We're going to defend the rights of the oppressed. We're going to defend the rights of the working class all around the world.
But see,
until we win this shit.
But see, the simple thing to do for most people, and I ask people of this all the time. Just this like a simple argument, for example, the DNC primary, and. Oh my God! You believe in conspiracy theories? Listen, let me ask you a question. It's the filter I always run everything through is it emotionally and intellectually honest to assume that someone is just taking money from the banks because the banks think they're doing good? Is Hillary Clinton taking money from oil and insurance? Did Barack Obama take money from those very same industries? Did he not spend the first 3 or 4 months of his second term calling people for his fucking library? Who do you think he's going to prosecute? Quick little side note. Jimmy Carter had over 70 antitrust investigations from his Justice Department in one term. How many did Barack Obama had in 8 years? Six.
No, and what is Obama's legacy? In terms of Obamacare, who have been the greatest beneficiaries? I mean, yes, the people have benefited. I believe that, but then the money that the government is paying out for the people to benefit, in whose pockets does it go?
We took a predatory product and made it mandatory for the consumer with no conditions or controls on the provider. And they could bounce out of the system at any time after they took our government taxpayer money. And we still have 30 million people uninsured under that plan, which was a Heritage Foundation written plan, with 45,000 people a year dying from a lack of coverage. 600,000 people that declared bankruptcy last year were for medical reasons, and they had health insurance. I have a very good friend of mine that I've known 20 years. Last November, had $325,000 of insurance payments rescinded by her company from March of 2017 to end of last year, November. So now her and her husband are all of a sudden on the hook for $325,000. They're going to have to pull equity out of their home. At this point now, I'm turning her into a crackhead who needs to go to the pawn store. How many toasters can you steal? Because this is without condition or penalty, right? Listen, in the last couple of minutes here, because we're running out of time. What kind of final thoughts you want to leave the listeners with, as we're going to come into a very tumultuous week anyway? This show's going to air on Monday. We're talking on a Saturday, but this show's going to air on a Monday. So, what do you want to sort of, what salvo do you want to send our people off with?
I think I sent it. I sent the last one.
Pretty badass.
I think folks need to challenge themselves as to which class do you really identify with, not just in your own country but around the world. What people are you understanding as the oppressed? And what people are you understanding as the oppressor, and to understand what the nature of these conflicts are about. Whose interests are being defended and whose interests are being attacked. And it becomes a very simple equation, I believe, because you have to come to terms, and this does not have to make you a blind believer. I have never been an apologist for any regime. My basic sort of assessment comes from who is going to benefit if this particular experiment is successful, and whose interests are not going to be benefited if the process goes through. Now, that does not mean that the process itself doesn't have flaws, right? So that's what I'm encouraging people to think about. What is the Bolivarian revolution? Educate yourselves about that. Understand what it meant to achieve, not just nationally, because Chavez was sending oil to every country, giving Honduras, giving Guatemala, giving Cuba oil, saying this is solidarity. Right. I have the oil and I'm going to help you so that we can break the chains of oppression at the international level, at the regional level. We need our power. We need our resources for ourselves. Let's work together. Let's help each other. He was sending oil to the Uruguayans. The Uruguayans were sending cows, meat, cheese, butter. And that was the idea. Does it mean that Chavez was flawless? It's ridiculous to expect that. Does it mean that this process is flawless? But do not lose track of the big picture, the big ball. What is being attempted, and what process do you want to get behind? And you can be critical. Revolutionaries need to be critical. Otherwise, we're not revolutionaries.
Right.
Any revolution that does not allow for internal criticism is never going to succeed. But there is a difference between internal criticism and sabotage. There is, or complicity with the enemy, and that's a big, big difference. And so we have, if you want to become militant, if you want to really have an opinion, first you need to learn what the sides are struggling for. and in which direction are they going? Because, if the betrayal, like my friend Tori in Houston, he feels that Maduro's betrayal as a revolutionary is enough for him to want him down. Okay, I tell Tori, that is your prerogative, man. At this point, I'm not prepared to say that, because when looking at the facts, when looking at the information, I believe that within the limitations of his regime, within the internal, conflicts that are being experienced from, like I said, issues of corruption and a lot of things that could be done better. Okay, there's still a struggle that is worth fighting for, right? Which is the autonomy and the self-determination of the working people of Venezuela through this government, which I believe will improve and can improve if it's allowed to, right? But this is how they bring regimes down. If you cannot breathe, you're going to choke. And the job of the United States and the job of Colombia and the job of all of the puppet states that are serving the interest of international capital, that are just dying to get that oil back, it's to choke the regime, to destabilize it, to destroy it, right? And so, and that's achievable. You can do that. You can do that to a human being. You can destroy a human being, and you can destroy a state.
Yep.
And so that is what is being attempted here. And this is not to excuse or justify errors, because, those things don't have to be mutually exclusive.
Right.
We have to break away from this idea that everything has to be black and white, right? I can say that. I can tell you, and I honestly believe that there is an attempt to destroy, to destabilize, and to sabotage a legitimate regime in a sovereign country right now, internally and externally.
Well,
and I can also tell you that the Maduro regime, needs to work at fixing itself. You know how I can tell you that? Because the Maduro regime is saying that to the people. Maduro recognizes that. He speaks about it.
Well, and wrapping up, because we're out of time, but he recognizes the economic missteps that they took by counting on oil exclusively and everything else. He gets that,
right.
And but anyway, listen. On that note, we gotta start wrapping it up. My guest, folks, today has been Adrian Boutureira, and obviously, if you've been listening this entire time, you know exactly what I know is that he knows what he's talking about. Again, we can be reached on patreon.com/The Bitter Truth if you want to become a bitter pill and get some freshly toasted bumper stickers. You can also, hit us on every format. We're on Stitcher and Spotify and blah, 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 and Podcast Addict. And again, guys, if this stuff makes you uncomfortable, it's supposed to, so sleep tight.